Hey guys, so today I want to talk about how to know when your mix is done. And this is going to be a two-part series. In this first video, we're going to talk about checking your mix before we go into mastering and making some final tweaks and adjustments. And then in the second video, we're going to talk about mastering your own mixes. Now, I know ideally you would have somebody else master your own mixes, but we'll get into that conversation in the next video. So you've been working on your mix for a while now, and you feel like you're getting close to the end, but it still doesn't sound right. You're not really sure what to do. When you get to that point, I think it's really important to remember what the vision is for your mix. Sometimes we can kind of lose sight of things and get too caught up in the details. So let's take a step back and look at the broader picture. Now for me personally, I think my vision for my mixes is to create width. Because I feel like if I'm able to create width, then that means I have successfully created clarity and brightness, loudness, and a balanced low end. So listen to one of your reference mixes that you consider a good mix, listen to the whole picture, and then listen to your mix and try to determine what's different about it. One thing I seem to notice about my mixes is they can be a bit cluttered. So usually in the final stages of my mixing, I'm making adjustments to create more width. So for every mix, there are three simple but very important steps. The first is balancing your faders and finding the optimum position for every instrument in your track. The next is proper EQ, creating space for all those different instruments and helping them work together. And then the third is compression, controlling the peaks and creating more impact or sustain for your instruments. Now you've probably already done all these things, but if you're like me, you might be pretty subtle with your adjustments at first because you're not sure how it's going to play in context with everything else. So usually what I have to do is I have to go back and look at all the adjustments that I've already made and push them a little bit further. I find that I usually have to do this with EQ. So let me give you an example with my mix here. So this was my mix getting near the end of the mixing stage. I was really happy with how everything sounded, but something just wasn't quite right. So let's have a listen. Now whenever I listened to that mix on its own, I always thought it sounded pretty good. But whenever I compared it to my reference, I noticed a few problems. So let me show you some of the adjustments I made. The main issue I noticed was with the guitars. They sounded kind of muddy compared to my reference. They weren't quite as clear and as present, and they weren't quite as wide as I wanted them to be. I noticed they sounded quiet, so the first thing I did was I just turned them up a little bit. Whenever I tried to cut out more mud, I just felt like I was losing some of that nice chunkiness to the guitars. So what I did instead was I took this shelf here and I boosted it about 2 more dB for a total of 3 dB, and then I turned the makeup gain back down 0.5 dB. And what I noticed was that this leveled out my guitars more evenly. Instead of being so crowded in the low end, I was able to push them down by turning down the entire volume just a little bit and raising the high end. So I kind of like, it's almost like tilting the EQ curve of the guitars and creating more balance, instead of cutting out some of that nice chunk and thickness to the guitars. For these middle bands, I was using these for complementary EQ, so I would find a frequency that sounded good in the right guitar and cut it out of the left guitar, and then find a frequency that sounded good in the left guitar and cut it out of the right guitar. Well, I pushed that a little bit further. Originally it was just 0.5. I ended up taking it down to minus 1 dB. And then I kind of did a similar thing with the low end. I looked for some mud in the guitars and I cut them out. So I feel like by cutting the mud out of one guitar, that place is being filled in from the frequencies of the other guitar and vice versa. So that was a way to sort of create more space in the middle of my mix, create more width, more separation between the two guitars, and more brightness and clarity in the overall sound. Another problem I had with my mix was perceived loudness. You know, we want our mixes to be able to hang with professional mixes, but we don't want to kill them. So I was kind of focusing on the high-ranged instruments. So I went over to my cymbals and I turned them up just a little bit, but I also gave them some more sustain with compression. So again, it's nice to experiment with different compressors. I felt like the Klanghelm compressor was very soft and subtle, like did something nice to the cymbals, but it held them out a little bit longer, so kind of created a little more perceived loudness in my mix. I also went to my kick and bass, and I realized that the MJUC Junior, for whatever reason, is a good compressor for low-ranged instruments. Somehow it kind of carves out the sound and gives it more clarity, but it also gives it more rumble in the low end, like good stuff, like growl in the bass or thump in the kick. I did all that, and then I also went to my mix bus and applied a slight EQ. I did a little shelf just to add some more top end. I felt like my mix was missing some mid-range content, so I looked for kind of the sweet spot and I did a little mid-range boost, and then I turned down the makeup gain about minus 0.5 dB. And somehow that kind of carved out my sound where it wasn't so like crowded. It kind of gave it more clarity and definition. So a lot of times you're probably already making really good mixing decisions. You just have to revisit those decisions and push them a little bit further. Another thing that's really important to check is to see how your mixes are going to translate out in the real world going through other speakers. So it's kind of a pain in the butt to have to bounce out your mix and listen to it and then make adjustments and bounce it again. So one thing I like to do is take the auxiliary output of my laptop and plug it into the auxiliary input of something like this. This is an iHome. Anytime I want, music on the go, this is a really cool device. And I listen through this all the time, so I'm fairly familiar with how good mixes sound through this. It's got a little input here that I can put my auxiliary cord into, and then I can just use these as my monitors, and I can make mixing decisions based on these. Now, whenever I do that, I always double check it back with my original monitors and in my headphones and make sure that the decisions I made were, beneficial and not totally destroying my mix. So that's one method I'll do. I'll also go out to my car, and my stereo has an auxiliary input, so I'm able to plug my laptop up to my car and actually make mixing decisions in there. Now, I don't know about your car, but for my car, I've realized that it's actually a really good place to check the low end and make sure it's really balanced. Sometimes I'll get my mix sounding good through my monitors and through my headphones, but then when I go to listen in my car, I'll notice it sounds kind of hollow. Not necessarily because the bass is too quiet in the mix. Usually it's something with compression, like it's compressing the peaks too much or something. So the car can be a good area to solve some of those problems with the low end. So the most important thing with all of this is to have a clear objective and not to nitpick, because you could look at the details of your mix forever and probably find something wrong or something you need to fix. But remember to focus on the core elements of the mix. How does the kick sound? How does the bass sound? Is your low end balanced? How's the snare sound? Does the song move? Does it have dynamic? Is everything balanced? As long as you can listen to it as a song, that's all that matters. Don't get caught up on the little details. And when it comes to effects and stuff, make snappy decisions. Spend some time trying to get a delay or reverb to work, and if you get it to work, great. But if it doesn't work, maybe you should just cut it. You don't have to have reverb or delay. You don't even have to always have compression or EQ. Sometimes you can try stuff and you can try so hard to make something work when really it doesn't need it at all. Have a clear objective, and once you've reached that objective, you're done. Move on. Let's go to mastering. Don't linger on that stuff, because it's really important to finish your projects and then to move on to the next one, because you will get better as you're working on song after song after song. If you keep working on the same one over and over again, you're really slowing down your progress. So those are my tips for checking your mix. If you guys have any tips for checking your mixes, please leave them in the comments section below. And stay tuned for part 2, where we're going to talk about mastering your own mixes. Until next time.